Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. I'm the only journalist on the panel, the only non-academic, so I'm extra honored to be at the best university in Sweden. Thanks for having me here. So, the question I've been asked, Lars asked me when we talked over the phone the other day, so what does Donald Trump's presidency mean for the future of the US on the world stage? Good question. That is a challenging question any week, any day, I would say, but perhaps even more so right now. So I'm going to start with the right now, if you don't mind, because it's so dramatic. Let's just look at where are we today. So this morning, I was talking to the Swedish Radio, my colleague in northern Syria, and she told me that she has to leave Syria today because al-Assad's troops are coming from the south toward the north, and they're coming quickly. So there's a complete game change in this conflict. They're coming to fight the Turkish invasion in northern Syria, where the Kurds are fighting to keep their region, as you know, Rojava. So Syria's undemocratic regime struck a deal with the Kurds to help them, while the US is now withdrawing its troops. That's where we are today. And this really remarkable turn of events kicked off just a week ago. Just a week ago, Sunday. It was Sunday when Donald Trump decided very unexpectedly to withdraw forces from the outpost in northern Syria, where American troops have been stationed for years. And he did this after a telephone call from President Erdogan from Turkey. And that move opened the way for this incursion from Turkey into northern Syria within days. The world, as you know, has condemned this move by Turkey. Sweden has condemned it. The European Union has condemned it. In the US, many lawmakers from both sides, both Republicans and Democrats, have condemned it as well, which is sort of new in DC, because so far the Republican lawmakers stand in line behind Donald Trump, whatever he does, but they don't when it comes to this latest event. So what does Donald Trump say? He says, look, I've delivered. I've delivered on yet another one of my campaign promises. This is what I promised to do during the campaign, to withdraw all the American troops from all those endless wars in the Middle East, and now I'm delivering. And among his voters and his supporters, I would say that this is a very popular decision. But it's not a very popular decision when it comes to lawmakers in Congress. Among politicians in DC, there is outrage. And even Trump's strongest political allies are critical. Trump is abandoning the Kurds, they say. He's creating a situation in the Middle East that could lead to a strengthening of ISIS, that in the longer perspective could lead to a really terrible security situation for the US. And how can the allies of the US now trust the US after this? It was only a year ago when we heard Donald Trump say at a press conference in Washington, D.C., he was thanking the Kurds for defeating ISIS, and he said, we will never forget you. And now this. So, why is he doing this? He's doing this because his strategy when it comes to foreign policy is America first, a nationalist economic view of the world, where he says, if it's economically good for the US, then we're going to do it. If it doesn't support US economical interests, then the US is not going to be involved. So from Donald Trump's point of view, the so-called endless wars in the Middle East, in Afghanistan, that's just costing money and lives and are not worth fighting for. And he often, by the way, talks about the other argument. They didn't help us out, so why should we help them? The Kurds didn't help us in World War II. Did you hear that the other day in Normandy? Which is sort of hard to follow the logic, since we all know what the Kurds did in the fight towards ISIS. Anyway, one of his strongest mantras when he talks about foreign policy is the US shouldn't be the police force of the world anymore. And that is a radical change from many of his predecessors, and a radical change from many of his party colleagues, I would say. That is not a traditional conservative foreign policy view. If you look back to George W. Bush, who always talked about fighting the axis of evil, fighting for regime change in countries that were at least strategically important to the US, of course, not any country, but the ones that were of strategical interest. That is not something that Donald Trump does. So I think if Trump stays on as president for 4 more years, we can expect more withdrawals of US troops from around the world, less engagement from the US. One other thing we can expect is less engagement from the US in all sorts of multilateral cooperations. We've seen Trump withdraw from multilateral institutions and agreements. We've seen him withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement, from the Iran nuclear deal agreement. Some would argue that he destroyed that agreement. He's criticizing NATO, he's criticizing the European Union, he's criticizing the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, all sorts of international multilateral organizations or agreements. Multilateralism is not Donald Trump's thing. He likes to make deals one-on-one with one country at a time, and he likes to put the Trump trademark on the deals. He's the deal maker, right? It's also worth pointing out, I think, that his America First campaign slogan, the word America First, that is borrowed from US isolationists from the 1930s. He held a speech at the UN General Assembly the other week, and he said, "The future does not belong to globalists, the future belongs to patriots." And that pretty much sums it up when it comes to his worldview on foreign policy. But the big question is, right now, how long is he going to be president in the US? Is he going to get 4 more years in November next year? That's possible. That's very much possible. Or is he going to get just a few more months because of the impeachment that is almost certain to happen at this point? In that case, he will be the first president ever to be removed from office. That hasn't happened so far. So the Democrats in Congress have started this impeachment process. That means they accuse Trump of having committed a crime, and they want to impeach him, which means bringing him to justice, right? It's a sort of a trial in Congress, where one part of the Congress, the House of Representatives, they are the ones who brings him to justice, and then the Senate decides whether he should be removed or not. And what they accuse him of is trying to get a foreign power to intervene in US domestic policies. You know the background. Some weeks ago, there was a whistleblower who revealed that Trump had been talking over the phone to Ukraine's president, Zelensky, and asked him to investigate allegations about Hunter Biden, who is a businessman, but he's more known as the son of Joe Biden, who is one of the hottest candidate right now for the Democratic ticket. Trump asked Zelensky for a favor, and at the same time, he held back millions of dollars in military aid to Ukraine. The Democrats say this is clearly a crime. He was trying to bribe the Ukrainian president. That's a crime, and it's a crime to ask a foreign power for help when it comes to intervening in domestic policies. And Trump says, no, not at all. Listen to Zelensky. He was not feeling pressed. This was a perfect conversation, nothing to see here. The Democrats are just bitter. This is just a political witch hunt. I think where we are right now, this will lead to impeachment. There will be an impeachment in the House in a couple of months, probably, and that is in itself historical. Only 2 presidents in history have so far been impeached. None of them have been removed. Andrew Johnson, 1868, Bill Clinton, 1998. So I think the likely scenario is that he is impeached, but not convicted by the Senate, because in the Senate, the Republicans have the majority. And from what we know right now, they don't have an appetite for removing the president from office right now. And even if it is a historically embarrassing event for any president to be impeached, it could actually strengthen him when you look at the campaign for 2020. It could strengthen him among his own base, because they see Donald Trump as the underdog, right? The guy who's fighting the establishment, the guy who is going to drain the swamp and put America first. I could talk so much more about the media climate, for example, the media as the enemy of the people, or about the way Donald Trump is changing the Supreme Court. That will, by the way, have an impact on abortion rights and gun laws down the road. But just to sum it up, there is a saying that what defines a US presidency is often something that is not known from the start. The big unknown is what defines a US presidency. For George W. Bush, this big unknown was obviously 9/11 and the terror attacks. That came to define everything about his presidency and about his foreign policy. For Barack Obama, I would argue that the Arab Spring was the one thing that defined his legacy as when it comes to foreign policy, and the fact that he didn't act and was criticized for that he didn't really grab the opportunity for change. But for Trump's presidency, I think the big unknown is Mr. Trump himself. We don't really know where he's going. We can see some signs when it comes to foreign policy, but we don't know how long his presidency will be or what mark it will have in the future. There are still a lot of big unknowns. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ginna. Let me ask you, before we continue here, let's say there is an impeachment, and let's say he is removed, which is not very likely, but if, then we have Mike Pence.
Right.
Is that a big difference?
That is, I would say that, I mean, Mike Pence has been in the shadows now since 2016. He never criticizes the president, but if you look at Mike Pence's record, he doesn't have many similarities with Donald Trump. If you look at his history, he's a conservative on the right side of the spectrum, I would say, and he's a conservative that comes from the Christian right. He's very morally conservative when it comes to abortion rights, when it comes to gun laws. He's critical against same-sex marriages, for example. So I think in Mike Pence we will have a much more conservative, less populist maybe president, but a much more conservative and right-wing president.
And in terms of foreign policy?
In terms of foreign policy, he has been very quiet. He has not been openly critical. But if you look at the party, you can't see any establishment voices right now in the Congress, in the Senate, among the Republicans who is supporting Trump's Syria policies right now. No one.
What do you say, the rest of you? We're looking at a United States of America who's isolating itself more and more, looking inwards, Maria?
Yeah, I was wondering when you were talking about Trump now leaving all these multilateral institutions, to what extent is there an internal debate, a domestic debate, at least from the Democrats and maybe others, who are still trying to sort of dispute it and try to, win a few votes on a different and maybe more internationalistic agenda rather than the isolationist?
Very much so, and as everything else, another trend that we see clearly in the US as in Europe is the polarization and the polarization of the debate. And the Democrats definitely try to grab this opportunity when it comes to promoting multilateral organizations and cooperations in a way that is a clear contrast toward Trump. So definitely.
Yeah, Rosberg was first.
Well, I mean, I agree with everything you said. One thing that I find interesting is, of course, let's say he is impeached in the Congress, that the proceedings start. He himself has said, in a sense, that people will take up guns if this process is continued. And as someone wrote rather recently, is really the civil war of the 1860s over? Was it ever really settled? So from your experience, how bad can it get?
Oh, wow. I think it's, how should I put this diplomatically? I think it's very worrisome that the rhetoric is increasing day by day and hour by hour. I've noticed it, from a journalistic point of view, as a journalist covering Trump's campaign meetings and events, it's really obvious, and it gets under your skin after a while. When you're at his meetings and he, within 10 minutes into his speech, he normally throws out the line fake news, and look at the media, the fake news media, and 4,000 people in the room turn around and they look at you and they shout and they give you the finger and they want to, they shout all sorts of things at you as a journalist. And now he's talking about, people grabbing their guns if there would be an impeachment. He could say that he doesn't mean it literally and that he's talking symbolically, of course. I think that's what he would say that he does, but words matter. And words can affect certain groups. And there is, we have seen increasing violence towards journalists, for example, in the US. So I think it does matter, and it is worrisome.
Claes-Göran.
Well, words matter, and I think the word that you used mostly was withdrawal. And I was wondering what's behind this word, and is there a counterword to withdrawal? Does Trump have an offensive attitude towards something? And in that case, what?
I think the opposite word in this case would be deal making. Withdrawal from the historic. He doesn't believe in the kind of organizations that US was a really important part of building after World War II. When it comes to international cooperation, he wants to withdraw from that, and he wants to withdraw from the Middle East. And instead, if you look at the America First mantra, it is very popular among his base because the economy, as you all know, is going really well in the US. And he is delivering on his campaign promises. This is what his base voted for, and he is delivering. And he's delivering deals with certain countries. For example, the new NAFTA agreement, which is better from a US production point of view.
Okay, do I have time?
Yeah, sure.
I should ask about the trade war with China, but I have another question I think is more interesting. Trump is completely incoherent, but I think we're all, and especially journalists, we're primed to try to draw out some sort of coherent story. How does it work reporting on someone who is so changeable? And even you're saying he's withdrawing, but at the same time, tomorrow maybe he could advance. How do you deal with this challenge?
I think the biggest challenge when it comes to reporting about Trump is the fact that he's a lot of the times not telling the truth. And as a journalist, you're used to, if you point out that a politician is lying, and when a politician is saying something that is factually just not true, usually that politician would change his campaign line or hers. In Washington Post nowadays, they have a fact-checking unit, which is awesome and large, even larger now during Trump's presidency because they have so much to work with. And they have a daily or sometimes weekly page that they call the Pinocchio test. Have you seen it? It's worth looking at. It's a test of politicians, what they say and if it's factually correct. They check it, and they grade it, and it could be true, then it's not a problem. Or if it's false, they give it 1, 2, or 3, or 4 Pinocchio. Pinocchio noses, you know, he lies. The longer the nose, the bigger the lie. I talked to some colleagues at Washington Post, and they said, we have a discussion in the newsroom, we don't know what to do, because he's lying all the time. And how many Pinocchio noses can we use? So they started using a new term, the bottomless Pinocchio, which is sort of, it never ends, right? The bottomless. And they have now counted to, I think the last time I looked, it was 12,000 lies from Donald Trump that they could factually check and show that this is not truthful, what he said here. But does it affect Donald Trump's voters? No. Because they think that the Washington Post is a part of the establishment that they find corrupt, right? So it just proves their point, that the Washington Post has been biased from the beginning against Donald Trump.
And this polarization is one of the ongoing problems that we have.
And as a Swedish journalist, I noticed the same thing. Every time I say on the radio that this is factually not true, I get tons of emails from people who tell me that I'm biased against Donald Trump, when I'm actually just reporting facts. That is a challenge.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Ginna, we ended with the bottomless Pinocchios. Thank you very much.
Thanks.